Welcome back to part 2 of the Environmental Humanities MOOCs lesson. In the previous lesson, we looked at key concepts about what constitutes the environmental humanities. Let's proceed further on our exploration of this field. So let's embark on our study of the environmental imagination and what it consists of. We shall first be looking at the key term environmentality. We have in the first part of our lesson, what is the environmental humanities, explored the key concepts and components of this field. We shall now proceed into some more details about what the field consists of. The environmental imagination, as the distinguished critic Laurence Buell has argued, examines ecological principles of life. It critiques human intervention in nature within quotes. It sees environmental crisis as a direct result of human actions across history, which require, of course, urgent and critical intervention to stop further damage. It looks at representations of the environmental imagination, ecological disaster in literary and cultural texts. Now here we need to understand that the environmental imagination is not restricted to high literature alone. It manifests itself in popular Hollywood eco-disaster films as wide-ranging as 2012, Waterworld, Mad Max Fury Road and others. It includes popular fiction such as Stephen King's The Stand. And there is, of course, the large canon of high literature that has focused politically of many dimensions in the last, say, 60 years or so on ecological crisis, starting with J.G. Ballard's classic work, The Drowned World in 1962, Neville Shute, Maggie G., Margaret Atwood, Cormac McCarthy, and numerous others. Laurence Buell uses the term environmentality to describe the mode through which literary and cultural texts, whether it is cinema, popular fiction, high literature, engage with ecological issues and concern. Examining texts as diverse as William Faulkner and Thomas Hardy to India's R.K. Narayan and others, Aboriginal authors, white authors, African American authors, this enables us to see how local ecosystems are constituted by a mesh of geography, history, politics, economics, and biology. Central to the environmental humanities is EcoSofi, or ecological philosophy. A key recent text in this field has been Tim Morton's The Ecological Thought, published in 2010. Ecological thinking, Morton argues, involves the humanities and the sciences. So you cannot argue that environment or eco-disaster is the subject only of departments of environment studies. It is something that involves the humanities as well. It requires us to move beyond the immediate and the local to think in terms of something larger, the global, and even perhaps the planetary. That is, local politics and policies are based on local needs, as they are essential to address immediate concerns, but situations like global warming demand a global response. We have to see ourselves, therefore, from another vantage point. And Morton argues that we see outer space as an instance of such a vantage point. EcoSofi posits that all life forms are entangled and intertwined. We necessarily have to understand that human life cannot be distinct, separate, and fully autonomous from other forms of life. Hence, the key terms in EcoSofi are interconnectedness and meshing. Entangled lives. We are all connected to each other and other life forms. We are dependent upon each other. Therefore, we do not think of evolution as proceeding only through competition, but through cooperation as well. EcoSofi refuses to idealize or romanticize nature, and this is a key idea. As in, we do not think of nature as something pristine and pure and wonderful. We are a little skeptical by the idea of how the idea of nature itself has been constructed. Nature is neither the backdrop to nor prop for human culture. It's neither outside of the human nor distinct from what humans do. In other words, nature is what we are as a race constructing. Nature is what we build from our cultural practices, which could be anything from agriculture to nuclear technology. So it asks us to pay attention to those details of human lives, that is agriculture, various methods of farming, industrialization, urbanization, that we have ignored. For example, waste. So we need to start thinking again in terms of uncertainty, instability, and catastrophe. It's not just that we think of nature as positive and healthy. We need to think of what Tim Morton calls dark ecology, where we have to accept irony, contingency, ugliness, and horror. We need to deal with greater knowledge about other beings. By other beings, we mean strangers, those whom we do not understand. We become more ambiguous in the meanings we therefore will generate. We must, however, transcend, says Tim Morton, the apocalyptic approach. Now, this is something we need to dwell a little upon. We will have a later lesson on ecological disaster and popular culture. But to anticipate that in connection with what Morton calls dark ecology, traditionally ecological thought has focused on eco-disaster, that we can only envisage ecological change, such as say climate change or global warming, in terms of a disaster scenario. Tim Morton says that's not quite true. We need not necessarily take the apocalyptic route. Finally, we need to consider gender, sexuality and ability alongside ecological thought. I now move on to discussions of Arne Naess and his key work on deep ecology. Arne Naess conceptualized deep ecology and traced it back to the writing of Rachel Carson, who is widely credited in her book Silent Spring as having started 20th century ecological thought and ecological movement and ecological activism. Deep ecology believes in the sanctity of all life forms on Earth. In other words, we do not consider humanity as being positioned at a higher level and animals at a lower level and plant life elsewhere. We think that all life forms are equally sacred. It rejects the primacy and supremacy of the human race, traditionally called anthropocentrism, which believes that the human race is at the center of the world and the world revolves around them. It argues that it is human intervention that damages all ecosystems on Earth. It believes that Earth and all its life forms have an intrinsic value. In other words, it is not humanity that bestows value upon, say, the amoeba or the wolf or the larger dinosaur or any of those sort. As a form of life, they have intrinsic value. This value cannot be dependent upon human evaluation of them for their usefulness. In other words, what deep ecology tells us is humans always evaluate other life forms in terms of their utility for us. Is the domestic cat or the domestic cow or the domestic horse valuable? They are valuable because they perform certain functions. Now, this is an instrumentalization of nature. What it does is to say that any life form has value only if it is something that human beings can use. This, says deep ecology, is wrong. It believes that human population growth is fundamentally incompatible with the conservation of Earth's biodiversity. In other words, as humanity increases in volume, as humanity increases in number, it automatically changes the biodiversity equations. It advocates environmental education and consciousness. It argues, that is, that environmental education is not something you wait for disaster to happen. It should start much, much before. Having gone through EcoSofi and the environmental imagination, let's pay some attention now to a particular passage or case text. I've chosen here J.G. Ballard's classic novel, The Drowned World, first published in 1962. Ballard's novel, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, is an eco-disaster novel which speaks about the rising waters and the entire world is drowned. So how people survive across the world, and the novel is set primarily in London, and what happens when London city is slowly being inundated. For those of you who pay attention to newspapers, you will periodically recall reading about, say, Bombay under floods or Madras city under floods. And Ballard extends that argument to ask what happens when the world's water levels rise everywhere. This is what the passage says, and the passage is there for you to take a look at and read. I will not be reading out the entire text. You can scroll it for yourself. But what I want to draw your attention to is a set of specific themes that connects to what we have been saying about the environmental imagination. Ballard's text offers us numerous insights into the meshing of human life and nature. It argues and it demonstrates that a reverse evolution occurs due to the changed ecology. So we tend to think of humanity as having arrived at a certain moment in history. Ballard asks us to imagine what happens if this process is reversed, that you go backwards in the evolutionary scale. Humans, the passage says, have believed they are the supreme rulers of the earth. However, and this is crucial, when disaster is imminent, they recall that great lizards once ruled the earth. And a character, Kerens, notes their memories. So humans as a race have forgotten evolution. When nature reclaims what has been taken from it, the ancient past returns with no respect for this human civilization. In other words, what we are looking at is we need to acknowledge, concede that we are also one moment in the evolutionary scheme on Earth. We do not think we should not think, we ought not to think that we have arrived at the highest level of human evolution. We are one stage. So it's possible that over a period of time, because of ecological change, damage, disaster, whatever you want to call it, this process of evolution will continue or might reverse. So if the ecosystem changes, will humanity remain the way it is now? Ballard says, perhaps not. As we come to a close of this particular lesson on the environmental humanities and the environmental imagination, let me quickly recall for you what we have been looking at so far. We have looked at EcoSofi, that is ecological philosophy via the thoughts and arguments offered by Tim Morton. We have in the previous module looked at things like slow violence. We have also conceptualized via texts and case studies what it means to have a reversal of human evolution, what it means to say that there is slow violence, Rob Nixon's theme, and we have addressed concepts such as Anthropocene and critical animal studies. We shall continue with further explorations in subsequent modules.